Do your eyes burn with anger and anguish when you have to read James Joyce's Araby? If so, you're in the right place, because today we're going to take a look at some of the major points of the story, and by the end of the video, hopefully make it so you better understand this kind of confusing ending to this story. So let's dive right into it. So the biggest frustration with this story seems to be its lack of plot, and the plot can really be boiled down to boy sees girl, boy likes girl, boy tries to impress girl with buying her a present, and instead, boy doesn't buy anything and just looks up at the ceiling in a sad fashion. Not much to go off of. But James Joyce isn't really interested in plot. He's much more interested in character. And the narrator, even if the plot seems kind of anticlimactic, the narrator fuels this story. And we know a lot about him. For one thing, he's a thinker. Right? He's an interesting character because he points out things for us like his house, a priest died in it, and he knows what room the priest died in. He tells us funny bits about like when he's going to the marketplace with his aunt and he thinks he's a knight going through a gauntlet with a prize for this princess. He notices things like his uncle's reaction from coming home from work. He doesn't ask his uncle if he can go to the Araby right away because of the way he takes off his shoes and puts his coat away and his keys and all that sort of stuff. So he's very observant. He notices all these things. Speaking of his aunt and uncle, he's also raised by them, so he seems to be an orphan. And we don't get a lot of detail about this, but certainly if you were writing a paper on this story, that's a detail that Joyce wants you to know, and you can definitely theorize about it, right? He doesn't have his parents to talk to. We don't know what happened to them. Instead, he's with his aunt and uncle who seem to care a lot about him, but certainly don't quite get what he's going through at this moment. And then, of course, what really fuels the story is he's the first of his friends to fall for a girl. The story opens with him and his friends playing outside. Near the end of the story, his friends are still playing outside, but he's up in a window thinking about this girl who lives across the street from him, the sister of one of his friends. So his friends are still going on with their kind of early childhood life, and he's moving into adulthood, and it's a strange, confusing time for him, which anyone over the age of like 13 or 14 can probably relate to. And it really seems to set us up though for this Hollywood-like story, but it doesn't go that way. Instead, the way it goes, I think, is really interesting, but very confusing. So to help us better understand that ending, we need to think of the imagery that Joyce is using. And what I did here is I marked out the dark or unseen, like hidden, blind imagery, and the bright or visible images in the story. And I didn't get all of them, but just from what I pointed out, you can tell a couple of things. One, there's a lot more dark images in this story. But more interesting than that is where they're at. I marked paragraphs, that's the numbers after the quotes and sentences, since everyone's probably going off a different edition. But if you kind of count out the paragraphs, you can see that the dark images start at the beginning of the story and go all the way to the end of it. So they're varied and they're continuous throughout, whereas the light images are all concentrated in one spot. And that spot is the mention or the actual interaction of this girl our narrator is interested in. The first one is in paragraph 3, the light of her window, but the majority of them are in paragraph 8, where she's described as having a silver bracelet, and there's light from the lamp, and there's the white curve of her neck, and it lights up her hair, and it lights up her hand, and her dress has a white border. So all of this is very intentional images, but the light imagery stops, and at the end of our story, if you look at these ones, it's all very dark, and it's the darkest images in the entire story. So that's going to be one key to understanding the ending. Before we get to that, though, we have to take a look at one other character, and that's the love interest, his friend's sister. So we don't get to know a lot about her. Notice, for one thing, she doesn't have a name. We're told that her name is a summons to the narrator's foolish blood, but we never get to know that name. And I don't know if that's because it's not important, or because he doesn't really know her, or a combination of both. But for one thing he definitely doesn't know about her is what her plans in life are. Because a huge thing back in that paragraph 8 with all the light imagery that is kind of buried in there, almost that the reader can almost miss it, is what she wants to do with her life. Because we are told she cannot go to the Araby because she has a retreat at her convent that weekend. And this is totally ignored by our narrator. But if she has a retreat at her convent, it means that she is going to be a nun. And if she is going to be a nun, she is not going to date. So this guy is so far out of his league in trying to date this girl. I mean, he has not just the fact that he doesn't know her or barely talks to her, or that he's like 13, but also that she's made a vow to God to be celibate. And this detail does not deter him from trying to impress her by buying her something. And that really sets up the ending quite well. So to understand these confusing last lines of the story, gazing up into the darkness, I saw myself as a creature driven and derided by vanity, and my eyes burned with anguish and anger. To understand those, we need to understand every word, because it's very important lines. So 2 words you might not know just off the top of your head are derided, which is to be laughed at or insulted or to be made a fool by. So now we know that he sees himself as someone who is motivated, driven, and also laughed and made a fool by vanity. And if you don't know what vanity means, it's pride in one's own appearance and achievements. And this is such an interesting ending to me, because it's not a boy meets girl, they fall in love happily ever after. It's boy meets girl, boy tries to do everything to get the girl, and then realizes he was a fool. That he wasn't even in love with her, he was in love with the idea of her, or maybe just what it made him feel like, with no concern to her feelings or her goals in life. And isn't that a story that we should have more of in this world? And when he discovers this, it's in conjunction with the imagery. If you think back to those last images, the narrator is in complete darkness when he utters this sentence. He's at this Araby, he's in a tent, and we are told that the light in the tent is extinguished, and he stares up at the ceiling of the tent from under it with no light when he says this. So now all the light represented by the girl and maybe his hope of dating her or getting to know her or whatever is gone. He's staring in complete darkness. He's under a tent with no light source. So it's just a pitch black, complete darkness. And I think that really makes the ending make more sense. The imagery is very much tied into the discovery or the epiphany that happens with the character. We know that this is a reflection. The narrator is telling us about this event that happened to him in the past, and all he understands, what he chooses to end with, is this epiphany, this discovery, that he was driven by vanity, and it makes him feel ashamed. And it's something I think a lot of us learn when we fall for someone for the first time. So I would just like to remind you, when you're frustrated by this story, if you were, that yes, the plot seems kind of silly or anticlimactic, but the plot is just a means to the character. I think this is a really fascinating character. One last thing to talk about is the title. If we could return to that for a second. Don't neglect to think about what the title means if you have to write about this. It's titled Araby, not someone's name, not an event. It's the place where this epiphany happens. And I think that really helps focus us as readers and commenters on this story in terms of what we want to say about it. So I hope that helped. If you have any other questions about the story or anything English related, post them in the comments. Best of luck with your papers or finals or tests, or just better understanding of great Irish literature. Thanks, and maybe I'll see you next time. Bye.